9. Subconscious persuasion. In a footnote appended to the 1919 edition of his book The Interpretation of Dreams, Sigmund Freud called attention to the work of Dr. Poetzel, an Austrian neurologist who had recently published a paper describing his experiments with the tachistoscope. The tachistoscope is an instrument that comes in two forms: a viewing box into which the subject looks at an image that is exposed for a small fraction of a second, or a magic lantern with a high-speed shutter capable of projecting an image very briefly upon a screen. In these experiments, Poetzel required the subjects to make a drawing of what they had consciously noted of a picture exposed to their view in a tachistoscope. He then turned his attention to the dreams dreamed by the subjects during the following night and required them once more to make drawings of appropriate portions of these dreams. It was shown unmistakably that those details of the exposed picture which had not been noted by the subject provided material for the construction of the dream. With various modifications and refinements, Poetzel's experiments have been repeated several times, most recently by Dr. Charles Fisher, who has contributed 3 excellent papers on the subject of dreams and preconscious perception to the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Meanwhile, the academic psychologists have not been idle. Confirming Poetzel's findings, their studies have shown that people actually see and hear a great deal more than they consciously know they see and hear, and that what they see and hear, without knowing it, is recorded by the subconscious mind and may affect their conscious thoughts, feelings, and behavior. Pure science does not remain pure indefinitely. Sooner or later, it is apt to turn into applied science, and finally into technology. The theory modulates into industrial practice. Knowledge becomes power. Formulas and laboratory experiments undergo a metamorphosis and emerge as the H-bomb. In the present case, Poetzel's nice little piece of pure science and all the other nice little pieces of pure science in the field of preconscious perception retain their pristine purity for a surprisingly long time. Then, in the early autumn of 1957, exactly 40 years after the publication of Poetzel's original paper, it was announced that their purity was a thing of the past. They had been applied. They had entered the realm of technology. The announcement made a considerable stir and was talked and written about all over the civilized world. And no wonder, for the new technique of subliminal projection, as it was called, was intimately associated with mass entertainment, and in the life of civilized human beings, mass entertainment now plays a part comparable to that played in the Middle Ages by religion. Our epoch has been given many nicknames: the age of anxiety, the atomic age, the space age. It might, with equally good reason, be called the age of television addiction, the age of soap opera, the age of the disc jockey. In such an age, the announcement that Poetzel's pure science had been applied in the form of a technique of subliminal projection could not fail to arouse the most intense interest among the world's mass entertainees, for the new technique was aimed directly at them, and its purpose was to manipulate their minds without their being aware of what was being done to them. By means of specially designed tachistoscope, words or images were to be flashed for a millisecond or less upon the screens of television sets and motion picture theaters during, not before or after, The program, drink Coca-Cola, or light up a camel, would be superimposed upon the lover's embrace, the tears of the broken-hearted mother, and the optic nerves of the viewers would record these secret messages. Their subconscious minds would respond to them, and in due course they would consciously feel a craving for soda pop and tobacco. And meanwhile, other secret messages would be whispered too softly or squeaked too shrilly for conscious hearing. Consciously, the listener might be paying attention to some such phrase as, "Darling, I love you," but subliminally, beneath the threshold of awareness, his incredibly sensitive ears and his subconscious mind would be taking in the latest good news about deodorants and laxatives. So, this kind of commercial propaganda really worked. The evidence produced by the commercial firm that first unveiled a technique for subliminal projection was vague and, from a scientific point of view, very unsatisfactory. Repeated at regular intervals during and showing a picture in a movie theater, the command to buy more popcorn was said to have resulted in a 50% increase in popcorn sales during the intermission. But a single experiment proves very little. Moreover, this particular experiment was poorly set up. There were no controls and no attempts was made to allow for the many variables that undoubtedly affect the consumption of popcorn by a theater audience. And anyhow, was this the most effective way of applying the knowledge accumulated over the years by the scientific investigators of subconscious perception? Was it intrinsically probable that by merely flashing the name of a product and a command to buy it, you would be able to break down sales resistance and recruit new customers? The answer to both these questions is pretty obviously in the negative. But this does not mean, of course, that the findings of the neurologist and psychologist are without any practical importance. Skillfully applied, Huxley's nice little piece of pure science might well become a powerful instrument for the manipulation of unsuspecting minds. For a few suggestive hints, let us now turn from the popcorn vendors to those who, with less noise but more imagination and better methods, have been experimenting in the same field. In Britain, where the process of manipulating minds below the level of consciousness is known as strobonic injection, investigators have stressed the practical importance of creating the right psychological conditions for the subconscious persuasion. A suggestion above the threshold of awareness is more likely to take effect when the recipient is in a light hypnotic trance under the influence of certain drugs, or has been debilitated by illness, starvation, or any kind of physical or emotional stress. But what is true for suggestions above the threshold of consciousness is also true for suggestions beneath that threshold. In a word, the lower the level of a person's psychological resistance, the greater will be the effectiveness of strobonically injected suggestions. The scientific dictator of tomorrow will set up his whispering machines and subliminal projectors in schools and hospitals. Children and the sick are highly suggestible, and in all public places where audiences can be given a preliminary softening up by suggestibility, increasing oratory or rituals. From the conditions under which we may expect subliminal suggestion to be effective, we now pass to the suggestions themselves. In what terms should be the propagandist address himself? To his victims' subconscious minds. Direct commands, buy popcorn or vote for Jones, and unqualified statements socialism stinks, or X's toothpaste cures halitosis, are likely to take effect only upon those minds that are already partial to Jones and popcorn, already alive to the dangers of body odors and the public ownership of the means of production. But to strengthen existing faith is not enough. The propagandist, if he is worth his salt, must create new faith, must know how to bring the indifferent and the undecided over to his side, must be able to mollify and perhaps even convert the hostile to subliminal assertion and command. He knows that he must add subliminal persuasion. Above the threshold of awareness, one of the most effective methods of non-rational persuasion is what may be called persuasion by association. The propagandist arbitrarily associates his chosen product, candidate, or cause with some idea, some image of a person or thing, which most people in a given culture unquestioningly regard as good. Thus, in a selling campaign, female beauty may be arbitrarily associated with anything from a bulldozer to a diuretic. In a political campaign, patriotism may be associated with any cause from apartheid to integration, and with any kind of person from a Mahatma Gandhi to a Senator McCarthy. Years ago in Central America, I observed an example of persuasion by association which filled me with an appalled admiration for the men who had devised it. In the mountains of Guatemala, the only important artworks are the colored calendars distributed free of charge by the foreign companies whose products are sold to the Indians. The American calendars showed pictures of dogs, of landscapes, of young women in a state of partial nudity. But to the Indian dogs are merely utilitarian objects. Landscapes are what he sees only too much of every day of his life, and naked blondes are uninteresting, perhaps a little repulsive. American calendars were, in consequence, far less popular than German calendars. For the German advertisers had taken the trouble to find out what the Indians valued and were interested in. I remember in particular one masterpiece of commercial propaganda. It was a calendar put out by a manufacturer of aspirin. At the bottom of the picture one saw the familiar trademark on the familiar bottle of white tablets. Above it were no snow scenes or autumnal woods, and no cocker spaniels or bosomy chorus girls. No, the wily Germans had associated the pain relievers with a brightly colored and extremely lifelike picture of the Holy Trinity, sitting on a cumulus cloud and surrounded by St. Joseph, the Virgin Mary, assorted saints, and a large number of angels. The miraculous virtues of acetyl salicylic acid were thus guaranteed in the Indians' simple and deeply religious minds by God the Father and the entire heavenly host. This kind of persuasion by association is something to which the techniques of subliminal projection seem to lend themselves particularly well. In a series of experiments carried out at New York University under the auspices of the National Institute of Health, it was found that a person's feelings about some consciously seen image could be modified by associating it on the subconscious level with another image, or better still, with value-bearing words. Thus, when associated on the subconscious level with the word happy, a blank, expressionless face would seem to the observer to smile, to look friendly, amiable, outgoing. When the same face was associated also on the subconscious level with the word angry, it took on a forbidding expression and seemed to the observer to have become hostile and disagreeable. To a group of young women, it also came to seem very masculine, whereas when it was associated with happy, they saw the face as belonging to a member of their own sex. Fathers and husbands, please take note. For the commercial and political propagandists, these findings, it is obvious, are highly significant. If he can put his victims into a state of abnormally high suggestibility, if he can show them while they are in that state the thing, the person, or through a symbol, the cause he has to sell, and if, on the subconscious level, he can associate this thing, person, or symbol with some value-bearing word or image, he may be able to modify their feelings and opinions without their having any idea of what he is doing. It should be possible, according to an enterprising commercial group in New Orleans, to enhance the entertainment value of films and television plays by using this technique. People like to feel strong emotions and therefore enjoy tragedies, thrillers, murder mysteries, and tales of passion. The dramatization of a fight or an embrace produces strong emotions in the spectators. It might produce even stronger emotions if it were associated on the subconscious level with appropriate words or symbols. For example, in the film version of A Farewell to Arms, the death of the heroine in childbirth might be made even more distressing than it already is by subliminally flashing upon the screen again and again during the playing of the scene such ominous words as pain, blood, and death. Consciously, the words would not be seen, but their effect upon the subconscious mind might be very great, and these effects might powerfully reinforce the emotions evoked on the conscious level by the acting and the dialogue. If, as seems pretty certain, subliminal projection can consistently intensify the emotions felt by moviegoers, the motion picture industry may yet be saved from bankruptcy. That is, if the producers of television plays don't get there first. In the light of what has been said about persuasion by association and the enhancement of emotions by subliminal suggestion, let us try to imagine what the political meeting of tomorrow will be like. The candidate, if there is still a question of candidates, or the appointed representative of the ruling oligarchy, will make his speech for all to hear. Meanwhile, the tachyscopes, the whispering and squeaking machines, the projectors of images so dim that only the subconscious mind can respond to them, will be reinforcing what he says by systematically associating the man and his cause with positively charged words and hallowed images, and by strobonically injecting negatively charged words and odious symbols whenever he mentions the enemies of the state or the party. In the United States, brief flashes of Abraham Lincoln and the words government by the people will be projected upon the rostrum. In Russia, the speaker will, of course, be associated with glimpses of Lenin, with the words People's Democracy, with the prophetic beard of Father Marx, because all this is still safely in the future. We can afford to smile 10 or 20 years from now it will probably seem a good deal less amusing, for what is now merely science fiction will have become everyday political fact. Poetzel was one of the portents which, when writing Brave New World, I somehow overlooked. There is no reference in my fable to subliminal projection. It is a mistake of omission which, if I were to rewrite the book today, I should most certainly correct. 10. Hypnopedia. In the late autumn of 1957, the Woodland Road Camp, a penal institution in Tulare County, California, became the scene of a curious and interesting experiment. Miniature loudspeakers were placed under the pillows of a group of prisoners who had volunteered to act as psychological guinea pigs. Each of these pillow speakers was hooked up to a phonograph in the warden's office. Every hour throughout the night, an inspirational whisper repeated a brief homily on the principles of moral living. Walking at midnight, a prisoner might hear this still small voice, extolling the cardinal virtues or murmuring on behalf of his own better self, "I am filled with love and compassion for all, so help me God." After reading about the Woodland Road Camp, I turned to the second chapter of Brave New World. In the chapter, the director of hatcheries and conditioning for Western Europe explains to a group of freshman conditioners and hatchers the workings of that state-controlled system of ethical education, known in the 7th century after Ford as hypnopedia. The earliest attempts at sleep teaching, the director told his audience, had been misguided and therefore unsuccessful. Educators had tried to give intellectual training to their slumbering pupils, but intellectual activity is incompatible with sleep. Hypnopedia became successful only when it was used for moral training. In other words, for the conditioning of behavior through verbal suggestion at a time of lowered psychological resistance. Wordless conditioning is crude and wholesale, cannot inculcate the more complex courses of behavior required by the state. For that there must be words, but words without reason, the kind of words that require no analysis for their comprehension, but can be swallowed whole by the sleeping brain. This is true hypnopedia, the greatest moralizing and socializing force of all time. In the Brave New World, no citizens belonging to the lower caste ever gave any trouble. Why? Because from the moment he could speak and understand what was said to him, every lowercase child was exposed to endlessly repeated suggestions, night after night, during the hours of drowsiness and sleep. These suggestions were like drops of liquid sealing wax drops that adhere and crust, incorporate themselves with what they fall on, till finally the rock is all one scarlet blob. Till at last the child's mind is these suggestions, and the sum of these suggestions is the child's mind, and not the child's mind only, the adult's mind too, all his life long. The mind that judges and desires and decides, made up of these suggestions. But these suggestions are our suggestions, suggestions from the state. To date, so far as I know, hypnopedic suggestions have been given by no state more formidable than Tulare County, and the nature of Tulare's hypnopedic suggestions to lawbreakers is unexceptionable. If only all of us, and not only the inmates of the Woodland Road camp, could be effectively filled during our sleep with love and compassion for all. No, it is not the message conveyed by the inspirational whisper that one objects to. It is the principle of sleep teaching by governmental agencies. Is hypnopedia the sort of instrument that officials delegated to exercise authority in a democratic society ought to be allowed to use at their discretion? In the present instance, they are using it only on volunteers and with the best intentions. But there is no guarantee that in other cases the intentions will be good or the indoctrination on a voluntary basis. Any law or social arrangement which makes it possible for officials to be led into temptation is bad. Any law or arrangement which preserves them from being tempted to abuse their delegated power for their own advantage, or for the benefit of the state, of some political, economic, or ecclesiastical organization, is good. Hypnopedia, if it is effective, would be tremendously powerful instrument in the hands of anyone in a position to impose suggestions upon a captive audience. A democratic society is a society dedicated to the proposition that power is often abused and should therefore be entrusted to officials only in limited amounts and for limited periods of time. In such a society, the use of hypnopedia by officials should be regulated by law. That is, of course, if hypnopedia is genuinely an instrument of power. But is it in fact an instrument of power? Will it work now as well as I imagine it working in the 7th century AF? Let us examine the evidence. In the Psychological Bulletin for July 1955, Charles W. Simon and William H. Emmons have analyzed and evaluated the 10 most important studies in the field. All these studies were concerned with memory. Does sleep teaching help the pupil in his task of learning by rote? And to what extent is material whispered into the ear of a sleeping person remembered next morning when he wakes? Simon and Emmons answer as follows. 10 sleep learning studies were reviewed. Many of these have been cited uncritically by commercial firms or in popular magazines and news articles as evidence in support of the feasibility of learning during sleep. A critical analysis was made of their experimental design, statistics, methodology, and criteria of sleep. All the studies had weaknesses in one or more of these areas. The studies do not make it unequivocally clear that learning during sleep actually takes place, but some learning appears to have taken place in a special kind of waking state, wherein the subjects do not remember later on if they had been awake. This may be of great practical importance from the standpoint of economy in study time, but it cannot be construed as sleep learning. The problem is partially confounded by an inadequate definition of sleep. Meanwhile, the fact remains that in the American Army during the Second World War, and even experimentally during the First, the daytime instruction in the Morse code and in foreign languages was supplemented by instruction during sleep, apparently with satisfactory results. Since the end of the Second World War, several commercial firms in the United States and elsewhere have solid large numbers of pillow speakers and clock-controlled phonographs and tape recorders for the use of actors in a hurry to learn their parts, of politicians and preachers who want to give the illusion of being extemporaneously eloquent, of students preparing for examinations, and, finally and most profitably, of the countless people who are dissatisfied with themselves as they are and who would like to be suggested or auto-suggested into becoming something else. Self-administered suggestion can easily be recorded on magnetic tape and listened to over and over again, by day and during sleep. Suggestions from the outside may be bought in the form of records carrying a wide variety of helpful messages. There are on the market records for the release of tension and the induction of the relaxation, records of promoting self-confidence, much used by salesmen, records for increasing one's charm and making one's personality more magnetic. Among the best sellers are records for the achievement of sexual harmony, and records for those who wish to lose weight. I am cold to chocolate, insensible to the lure of potatoes, utterly unmoved by muffins. There are records for improved health, and even records for making more money. And the remarkable thing is that, according to the unsolicited testimonials sent in by grateful purchasers of these records, many people actually do make more money after listening to hypnopedic suggestions. To that effect, many obese ladies do lose weight, and many couples on the verge of divorce achieve sexual harmony and live happily ever after. In this context, an article by Theodore X. Barber, Sleep and Hypnosis, which appeared in the Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypotheses for October 1956, is most enlightening. Mr. Barber points out that there is a significant difference between light sleep and deep sleep. In deep sleep, the electroencephalograph records no alpha waves. In light sleep, alpha waves make their appearance. In this respect, light sleep is closer to the waking and hypnotic states, in both of which alpha waves are present, than it is to deep sleep. A loud noise will cause a person in deep sleep to awaken. A less violent stimulus will not arouse him, but will cause the reappearance of alpha waves. The deep sleep has given place for the time being to light sleep. A person in deep sleep is unsuggestible, but when subjects in light sleep are given suggestions, they will respond to them. Mr. Barber found in the same way that they respond to suggestions when in the hypnotic trance. Mr. Barber found in the same way that they respond to suggestions when in the hypnotic trance. Many of the earlier investigators of hypnotism made similar experiments. In his classical history, Practice and Theory of Hypnotism, first published in 1903, Milne Bramwell records that many authorities claim to have changed natural sleep into hypnotic sleep. According to Wetterstrand, it is often very easy to put oneself on rapport with sleeping persons, especially children. Wetterstrand thinks this method of inducing hypnosis of much practical value and claims to have often used it successfully. Bramwell cites many other experienced hypnotists, including such eminent authorities as Bernheim, Moll, and Forel to the same effect. Today, an experimenter would not speak of changing natural into hypnotic sleep. All he is prepared to say is that light sleep, as opposed to deep sleep without alpha waves, is a state in which many subjects will accept suggestions as readily as they do when under hypnosis. For example, after being told when lightly asleep that they will wake up in a little while feeling extremely thirsty, many subjects will duly wake up with a dry throat and craving for water. The cortex may be too inactive to think straight, but it is alert enough to respond to suggestions and to pass them on to the automatic nervous system. As we have already seen, the well-known Swedish physician and experimenter Wetterstrand was especially successful in the hypnotic treatment of sleeping children. In our own day, Wetterstrand's methods are followed by a number of pediatricians who instruct young mothers in the art of giving helpful suggestions to their children during the hours of light sleep. By this kind of hypnopaedia, children can be cured of bedwetting and nail biting, can be prepared to go into surgery without apprehension, can be given confidence and reassurance when, for any reason, the circumstances of their life have become distressing. I myself have seen remarkable results achieved by the therapeutic sleep teaching of small children. Comparable results could probably be achieved with many adults. For a would-be dictator, the moral of all this is plain. Under proper conditions, hypnopaedia actually works. Works, it would seem, about as well as hypnosis. Most of the things that can be done with and to a person in hypnotic trance can be done with and to a person in light sleep. Verbal suggestions can be passed through the somnolent cortex to the midbrain, the brainstem, and the autonomic nervous system. If these suggestions are well conceived and frequently repeated, the bodily functions of the sleeper can be improved or interfered with. New patterns or feeling can be installed and old ones modified. Post-hypnotic commands can be given slogans, formulas, and trigger words deeply ingrained in the memory. Children are better hypnopedic subjects than adults, and the would-be dictator will take full advantage of the fact. Children of nursery school and kindergarten age will be treated to hypnopedic suggestions during their afternoon nap. For older children, and particularly the children of party members, the boys and girls who will grow up to be leaders, administrators, and teachers, there will be boarding schools in which an excellent daytime education will be supplanted by nightly sleep teaching. In the case of adults, special attention will be paid to the sick. As Pavlov demonstrated many years ago, strong-minded and resistant dogs became completely suggestible after an operation or when suffering from some debilitating illness. Our dictator will therefore see that every hospital ward is wired for sound. An appendectomy and accouchement, a bout of pneumonia or hepatitis, can be made the occasion for an intensive course in loyalty and the true faith, a refresher in the principles of the local ideology. Other captive audiences can be found in prisons, in labor camps, in military barracks, on ships, at sea, on trains and aeroplanes in the night, in the dismal waiting rooms of bus terminals and railway stations. Even if the hypnopadic suggestions given to these captive audiences were no more than 10% effective, the results would still be impressive and, for a dictator, highly desirable. From the heightened suggestibility associated with light sleep and hypnosis, let us pass to the normal suggestibility of those who are awake, or at least who think they are awake. In fact, as the Buddhists insist, most of us are half asleep all the time and go through life as a somnambulist, obeying somebody else's suggestions. Enlightenment is total awakeness. The word Buddha can be translated as the wake. Genetically, every human being is unique and in many ways unlike every other human being. The range of individual variation from the statistical norm is amazingly wide, and the statistical norm, let us remember, is usually only in actuarial calculations, not in real life. In real life, there is no such person as the average man. There are only particular men, women, and children, each with his or her inborn idiosyncrasies of mind and body. There are only particular men, women, and children, each with his or her inborn idiosyncrasies of mind and body, and all trying or being compelled to squeeze their biological diversities into the uniformity of some cultural mold. Suggestibility is one of the qualities that vary significantly from individual to individual. Environmental factors certainly play their part in making one person more responsive to suggestion than another. But there are also, no less certainly, constitutional differences in the suggestibility of individuals. Extreme resistance to suggestion is rather rare. Fortunately so, for if everyone were as unsuggestible to some people as some people are, social life would be impossible. Societies can function with a reasonable degree of efficiency because, in varying degrees, most people are fairly suggestible. Extreme suggestibility is probably about as rare as extreme unsuggestibility. And this also is fortunate. For if most people were as responsive to outside suggestions as the men and women at the extreme limits of suggestibility, free rational choice would become for the majority of the electorate virtually impossible, and democratic institutions could not survive or even come into existence. A few years ago, at the Massachusetts General Hospital, a group of researchers carried out a most illuminating experiment on pain-relieving effects of placebos. A placebo is anything which the patient believes to be an active drug, but which is in fact is pharmacologically inactive. In this experiment, the subjects were 162 patients who had just come out of surgery and were all in considerable pain. Whenever a patient asked for medication to relieve pain, he or she was given an injection, either of morphine or of distilled water. All the patients received some injections of morphine and some of the placebo. About 30% of the patients never obtained relief from the placebo. On the other hand, 14% obtained relief after every injection of distilled water. The remaining 55% of the group were relieved by the placebo on some occasions, but not on others. In what respects did the suggestible reactors differ from the unsuggestible non-reactors? Careful study and testing revealed that neither age nor sex was a significant factor. Men reacted to placebo as frequently as did women, and young people as often as old ones. Nor did intelligence, as measured by the standard test, seem to be important. The average IQ of the two groups was about the same. It was above all in temperament, in the way they felt about themselves and the other people, that the members of the two groups were significantly different. The reactors were more cooperative than the non-reactors, less critical and suspicious. They gave the nurses no trouble, and thought that the care they were receiving in the hospital they gave the nurses no trouble, and thought that the care they were receiving in the hospital was simply wonderful. But though less unfriendly towards others than the non-reactors, the reactors were generally much more anxious about themselves. Under stress, this anxiety tended to translate itself into various psychosomatic symptoms, such as stomach upsets, diarrhea, and headaches. In spite of, or because of their anxiety, most of the reactors were more uninhibited in the display of emotion than were the non-reactors, and more vulnerable. They were also much more religious, much more active in the affairs of their church, and much more preoccupied on a subconscious level with their pelvic and abdominal organs. It is interesting to compare these figures for reaction to placebos with the estimates made in their own special field by writers on hypnosis. About a fifth of the population, they tell us, can be hypnotized very easily. Another fifth cannot be hypnotized at all, or can be hypnotized only when drugs or fatigue have lowered psychological resistance. The remaining three-fifths can be hypnotized somewhat less easily than the first group, but considerably more easily than the second. A manufacturer of hypnopedic records has told me that about 20% of his customers are enthusiastic and report striking results in a very short time. At the other end of the spectrum of suggestibility, there is an 8% minority that regularly asks for its money back. Between these two extremes are the people who fail to get quick results, but are suggestible enough to be affected in the long run. If they listen perseveringly to the appropriate hypnopedic instruction, they will end by getting what they want. Self-confidence or a sexual harmony, less weight or more money. The ideals of democracy and freedom confront the brute fact of human suggestibility. One-fifth of every electorate can be hypnotized almost in the twinkling of an eye. One-seventh can be relieved of pain by injections of water. One-quarter will respond promptly and enthusiastically to hypnopedia. And to these all too cooperative minorities must be added the slow starting majorities whose less extreme suggestibility can be effectually exploited by anyone who knows his business and is prepared to take the necessary time and trouble. Is individual freedom compatible with a high degree of individual suggestibility? Can democratic institutions survive the subversion from within of skilled mind manipulators trained in the science and art of exploiting the suggestibility both of individuals and of crowds? To what extent can the inborn tendency to be too suggestible for one's own good or the good of a democratic society be neutralized by education? How far can the exploitation of inordinate suggestibility by businessmen and ecclesiastics by politicians in and out of power be controlled by law? Again, how far can the exploitation of inordinate suggestibility by businessmen and ecclesiastics by politicians in and out of power be controlled by law? Explicitly or implicitly, the first two questions have been discussed in earlier chapters. In what follows, I shall consider the problems of prevention and cure.